world of cable news screaming and social media echo chambers, it's easy to lose the signal in the noise. Every day, policy is debated, votes are cast, and your tax dollars are spent. We cut through the headlines to bring you the critical context you need, focusing on what's really going on in news and politics. Welcome to the Analytical Iowan Podcast. This is your daily dose of fact-driven politics. Let's analyze today's news. Here's Eric.
We are back here on the Analytical Iowan Podcast. It is Sunday, November 9th, as you are listening to this, and of course we've got a lot to talk about. Now, we are still in the middle of a government shutdown. This is now day 40 of the government shutdown, and there still doesn't appear to be an end in sight. There was some movement, though, yesterday, a little bit. Now, what happened? Well, for the first time since the government shutdown really began, Congress, or at least the Senate, worked on a Saturday. Now, we're hearing conflicting reports, and some of that may come to a head today. There's going to be some votes today in the Senate on a couple of different bills, I think, about opening the government, at least on one for sure. And this is on an idea that was now floated by John Thune. He wants to extend certain parts of the government all the way till the end of September next year, and then the rest would be open until January. So they would have until the end of January to figure out the rest of the funding. Now, what Democrats had offered on Friday and John Thune had said was a non-starter was 1 year of Affordable Care Act subsidies. That was basically it. That was about as bare bones as it was going to get. But now the negotiators are actually talking about what's going on. Now, I do not know if this bill they are going to bring up today has the 1 year Affordable Care Act subsidies on it or not. John Thune had said that was going to be a non-starter. He didn't want to deal with it. He said, well, what we have to do is we have to open the government first, and then we have those kind of negotiations. Then we hold those votes after the government's open, after everything's funded. Here's the problem, and I talk about it a lot. Republicans have made those promises before, specifically in this Congress, just since Donald Trump took office again. Back in March, they agreed with Democrats, said, hey, you guys agree to keep the government open. You pass a clean CR, which the Democrats did. And Democrats took heat back in March for not fighting to get increases to some of these programs and trying to prevent some of the damage that was already looking like it could be done back then. And nobody thought things were going to get this bad in this administration this quickly. But they took heat for not pushing back against Republicans and just going along and passing a clean CR back then. But it came with a promise of later on we would discuss the Affordable Care Act subsidies. Well, later's here. Okay. And Republicans are still saying, we'll talk about it later. How much later is left? You have what? 52 days left in the year? And counting, basically every day they don't have a deal going and they don't actually negotiate this is one less day they have before those subsidies expire. Now, Republicans want those subsidies to go away. Why? Because they want the Affordable Care Act to fail. They don't like it. They have been trying to get rid of it since the beginning, but they don't have a plan to replace it. Donald Trump said during his first term that he had a health care plan. It was always about 2 weeks away, and we never saw it. Now, there was one interview where they brought it out, but it was a binder, thick full of paper. But then I don't know if it got shifted or fell or what. I don't remember exactly. But most of the pages were blank. It was a prop just to show something that they had an idea when they really didn't. They haven't had an idea to replace the Affordable Care Act. Now, earlier this year, there was a Republican in the House of Representatives. This was just a couple of weeks ago. He was asked about it, and his idea for replacing Obamacare was, well, we'll have to come up with something better. That sounds a lot like what Donald Trump said during the campaign when he was pressured under the debate with Kamala Harris, and she said, "So, what are your concepts of what are your healthcare plan?" And he said, "Well, I have concepts of a plan." Concepts of a plan is the beginnings of ideas. You don't actually have a plan at that point. And then saying, "Well, we just have to replace it with something better." Okay, what? And they can never answer that. Now, Donald Trump took to Truth Social and he announced his healthcare plan. Well, one of his healthcare plans and something that he thinks would be good enough to reopen the government that Democrats should just agree to. And that's they take insurance companies out of the equation. They don't do the subsidies, but rather they send what they would spend on the subsidies to every American who would qualify for the Affordable Care Act exchanges and basically let them go get their own health care. Okay, a couple things with that. One, where does he think they're going to buy the health care from? Are they going to go directly to the hospital? Most Americans cannot afford one major medical bill. Even with insurance, sometimes they struggle, and depending on your coverage, that one bill might be enough to where you are considering bankruptcy over one medical bill because our healthcare in this country sucks. But if he thinks he can just give everybody that's on the exchanges, a subsidy and that they're just going to be able to go get healthcare, well, all they're going to do is go to the insurance companies that they are already getting insurance from through the exchanges. Their premiums are going to be higher because the subsidies are gone. Pay the higher premiums with the money from the kickback from the government, from that rebate check, whatever you want to call it. So it's doing the same thing they're already doing with extra steps. And besides that, you also have no guarantee by sending the American people a check. There are going to be people who, instead of spending the money on their insurance like they're supposed to with those subsidies, they're going to risk it without the insurance and decide, well, you know what, that subsidy check, depending on how big it is, well, it's more important that I put that on my mortgage, or it's more important that I pay my rent with it, for 2 or 3 months, or whatever that number is, right? They're not going to actually spend it. At least there's going to be people that will spend it on healthcare. Don't get me wrong, but there's going to be a significant portion of the group, and whether that's 5 or 10%, whatever that number is, I couldn't tell you. I'm guessing here. I will admit that, but I know how people who are struggling think because I've been there myself at times. You say, okay, well, I can't really afford that right now, but if I put the money over here, this covers the immediate need and takes this problem out of the equation. I will worry about healthcare later. Something like that. I could see him doing it. So Donald Trump is basically just saying, well, instead of giving it to the insurance companies directly, we'll give it to the American people. But the way he phrased it was like the insurance companies would never see a dime of the money he was sending the American people. Well, if he means it like that, then that means he's talking about sending enough money to where the American people can just afford to go to the doctor without insurance. Well, if we're going to do that, why don't we just take it a step further? Why don't we go to Medicaid for all, Medicare for all, universal health care of some kind? And I know there's a section of this country that's going to say, oh, that's socialism. We can't do that. We have socialistic programs all over the place. You don't realize it because nobody else calls it that. But when you have an incident and you need to call the police, for example, they show up to help you out with whatever's going on. Maybe somebody hit your car, right? Car's parked on the street, somebody hit your car. You call the police, fill out an accident report. Okay? They don't show up and say, well, it's going to cost you $200 for me to fill out this accident report, because that's your share of what it costs for us to do this job right now. You don't get a bill. not from the police anyway, for them doing that part of their job. That's socialized uh, police work, because your taxes, your city and local taxes, people's property taxes, all of that goes in to funding that service. Same thing a lot of times with the fire department. Almost every fire department, I believe, is uh, socialized. When they show up and there's a fire at your house, they don't charge you a bill to put it out, unless the way I understand it is, if at least a lot of the fire departments around here, is if they can prove you either started it yourself or something like that. Like if you intentionally started it, not that it was an accident. Because I know I had a coworker who had a building. They had built a new house on their farm lot, and when they built the new lot, they decided to burn down the old house. Okay, that happens a lot, not a big deal. But he said he was going to do it himself, but he called the local fire department about it, and they said, "Well, how about this instead? You let us come out. We do a controlled burn. We do it, use it for training exercises. We don't charge you a dime to do that, and then um, you're fine." And he's like, "Well, I thought I'd just do it myself, and I could, put it out if need be." And they said, "Well, you could try that, but if it gets out of control and you need us to come out and put it out later, they could charge him for the cost of putting out that fire, because it was something you did on purpose. It wasn't an accident." But that's different, right? We have socialized things like that. So if we go to with Donald Trump saying he wants to kick out premiums to people, or these payments, why not just take it a step further? Let's go to universal health care. And for those that are saying, well, universal health care would never work, I don't want the government making healthcare decisions for me. If you do it right, it wouldn't be anything like what you're used to with regular insurance. There would be no reason for there to be any sort of a government panel or anything like that. Basically, it would be, you go to a primary care doctor. Anybody goes to a primary care doctor anywhere in the country. Government says, okay, we're covering it at 100%. You don't have a copay. I'm just going to say that's how they do it. I don't know. Whatever they come up with. Maybe it's $10 copay. Whatever the number is, right? And it happens no matter what doctor you go see. Okay, you need to go see a specialist. It's this amount that specialist gets paid. Period. X-rays, whatever that number is per X-ray. And there's no insurance involved. It's just they're paying the bill. Right now, you go to the doctor, and the doctor decides you need a prescription, right? Depending on what the prescription is, sometimes if the insurance company thinks it's too expensive of a prescription, or that they should try something else, you have to jump through 3 or 4 hoops. You have to go back to the doctor, have them fill out paperwork for the prior authorization to send it back into the insurance to say, no, this is why I didn't try X, Y, and Z. I want them on this med. And the insurance companies have way too much power over what gets covered. Just like one of the things that they have to test for, they do all these testing, and sometimes they're testing for things that maybe they wouldn't normally test for if they weren't billing insurance, but because insurance requires it in order to be paid for actually getting to the final result they need, maybe they have to do extra tests and extra steps, because otherwise insurance says, well, you didn't follow all the steps, and we don't think, you did unnecessary testing because you didn't do this other test, even though maybe they're not exactly connected. So with universal health care, you would just go to the doctor. They would give you a prescription. They would set you up on your tests, and it would be paid, and it would be done. There wouldn't necessarily be any government decision. But it gets scary because people are afraid of what could happen. Now, one of the big arguments against universal health care is it's going to take you forever to go see your doctor, and you're going to have all sorts of wait times. Well, there's already wait times. I was having a conversation with somebody. I think I mentioned this on a podcast before. They had to go see a specialist, and they had to wait, I think it was 4 or 5 months to go see that specialist, is when the next available appointment was that they could schedule. And we were talking about it, and they said, "Oh, well, if we go to universal health care, we do something like what Canada has. Oh, you'd have to wait 3 or 4 months to go see a doctor." I go, "How long out were you just for the specialist?" "Oh, well, yeah, I guess, 4 to 5 months." It wouldn't change much. Only difference is you wouldn't have to deal with insurances. You wouldn't have to select coverages every year. You wouldn't have to figure out what can you afford, what can't you afford. You know, uh, open enrollment's going on right now. I was just looking at insurance for work yesterday myself, trying to decide whether I go with the higher cost up front with the higher premium insurance, or do I go with the lower premium, but it's going to cost me more on the back end. It's going to cost me more in deductibles. It's going to cost me more in copays, things like that. And people are having these decisions. So when Donald Trump says he wants to give you all uh, some kind of a rebate check so you can go get your own health care, he doesn't understand how health care works. I guarantee you he has probably never had private insurance. He's probably never had insurance other than what he got after becoming president, which now he's got access to the best health care in the country. He effectively has socialized health care because he doesn't pay copays or anything like that. He just goes to the doctor. And now we find out when he does go, they're testing him for dementia. They're putting him through the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. They're giving him MRIs as part of routine physicals, which isn't something that normally happens. Makes you wonder how bad his health really is. And there's going to be at least a section of this country when they hear he is talking and floating about this idea of just kicking out a check to everybody. Like I said, that they're going to be looking at, well, can I spend it on whatever I want? Some will. And they're going to cheer him because, oh, he put money in my pocket, not realizing he's screwing them on the back end because it's going to make their health care way more expensive. And if they just choose not to get the health care, they're not coming out ahead. They're really not. They're just taking a lot of risk, and one major medical bill could bankrupt them. Now, is Congress going to accept this idea from Donald Trump? I don't think so. I haven't heard anything from any senators, nothing from the House of Representatives that they actually agree with this kind of idea. But this is just another way Donald Trump is throwing something out there. He is throwing anything at the wall, trying to see what'll stick to get this government shutdown over. But this isn't negotiating. This is demanding. This is, like I said, throwing anything at the wall because he wants it over. He wants to look like the winner. He wants to have the government open. And the longer they go without it being open, the worse he is looking. We are in a record-setting government shutdown. We are at day 40, and they're still barely negotiating. Republicans are still trying to say, well, give us what we want, and we'll just give you guarantees or promises for later. Well, Democrats aren't falling for that anymore. They're not saying, yeah, we'll agree with that. They've gotten burned one too many times, and they finally learned not to touch the hot stove. So now they're saying, okay, this is where we have the leverage. Give us what we want, and we will open, the government. We will fund everything if we do that. So we'll have to see if there's any progress made today with these votes. But simple fact is, John Thune has said the Senate is going to be working through the weekend in order to keep things progressing. And they're basically, he said, made it sound like they are going to stay in session until they come up with some resolution to open the government. Now, I don't know if that means they're going to keep working through Thanksgiving. They may take a couple days at Thanksgiving anyway, if the government is still shut down by that point. But we are going to have to come to a resolution here. And I think ultimately it is going to be the Republicans that cave. Because Democrats proved this week with those elections when they were winning in places where they historically didn't win. I mean, they picked up 3 Senate seats for the state house in Mississippi. They won the Virginia's governor race with like 60%, 65% of the vote. They were thinking it was going to be close, and it wasn't even close. I mean, there weren't, I don't think, hardly any areas where Democrats would normally win. I don't think Republicans had a single pickup across the country on that election. So Republicans are going to be the ones to cave here. Now, we are also hearing that um, Sean Duffy, the transportation secretary, somebody we don't normally talk about, is talking about cutting out 10% of air traffic from certain major airports and having to reroute flights and things like that, which is going to cause delays. Now, why are they doing that? Because the air traffic controllers are not going to work. Some of them are calling out. Some of them are doing it because they're trying to prove a point because that they're tired of going to work without getting paid. They're on 40 days of no pay. And some of them are saying simply that they can't afford to keep going to work because they have kids that need daycare. And those daycare providers are not willing to keep providing services for free, even though they know eventually these air traffic controllers are going to get paid and there will be um, back pay for everybody affected, because that is how the government has always handled it. Even though Donald Trump has tried to say, well, maybe we shouldn't pay them, because Donald Trump doesn't like to pay his bills. He thinks they should just work for free out of the goodness of their heart or something. But that's not how we do things. There would be something to back pay those furloughed employees, and even the ones that are working that are considered essential. Now, they've tried to pass things to fund that, but it has not passed yet. And Mike Johnson is pretty much saying, well, why would we bring the House back into session to pass that until the government's back open? We'll open the government first, and then we'll worry about getting those people paid, which, again, Democrats aren't falling for. They're saying we need to have all of it hammered out in the bill to open the government, because otherwise we have no guarantee that you will actually do any of this. Republicans have agreed to things all the time, and then they don't negotiate in good faith. I talked about how back in March, they agreed to fund the government at a certain level with promises to talk about the Affordable Care Act subsidies later. Later's here. But beyond that, they had agreed in March to fund the government at a certain level. And then in July, they passed the One Big Beautiful Bullshit bill, where they cut a bunch of funding to a bunch of programs, including SNAP benefits, WIC, food pantry assistance, which is coming back to bite them, and Medicaid. Okay. So even the CR that is supposedly clean, that they keep saying is a clean CR, isn't, because it is not at the levels that they agreed to in March the last time they passed the CR. Republicans passed that one big bullshit bill without a single Democratic vote. And that's a problem for Republicans. Democrats are saying, okay, well, we can't trust you, even if we pass this clean CR right now, even at the current levels. What's to prevent you from 2 months from now, 3 months from now, coming through and cutting even more spending? There's nothing preventing it. You guys don't guarantee anything, so we need to get what we can get while we can here. And why should we listen to any promises from you? And Democrats are waking up to it. So we'll see if they hold the line and how this goes going forward. Like I said, they're working through the weekend. They're going to be holding votes on opening the government and funding everything coming up today. I'll have more on that tomorrow. Now, Donald Trump basically told Senate Republicans to stay in D.C. and keep working. Now, I don't know if that is why they are staying in D.C. and continuing to work, trying to open the government. But see, he delivered the message to the Senate, but he wants the Democrats just to cave and give in so that they can open the government without giving in any concessions. but he didn't give the same message to the House. The House has been out since the end of September, since actually before the end of September. They're going on 6 or 7 weeks now of not being in session. And it is, they keep finding reasons to stay gone. Mike Johnson keeps saying, well, they're doing important work back in their districts. What work? Listening to their constituents? No, because they're not doing town halls. When they were doing those, they were getting yelled at and embarrassed and blown up by their own constituents, by their own voters, because of doing things like cutting Medicaid. And that has led to certain people like Senator Joni Ernst here from Iowa saying, I am not running for reelection, in part because she opened her mouth and said something stupid at one of these town halls about Medicaid. Way back before they passed the one big beautiful bill, somebody said, hey, what am I supposed to do if you cut my Medicaid? I can't afford to live without it. I will die. And she goes, well, we're all going to die someday. Yeah, that's what they think about people who need assistance. Yeah, we're all going to die someday. So if we don't need to worry about making sure you have health care because, well, what's the difference? You die now, you die 2 years from now, maybe you live another 20. What's the difference? It's the same thing. So Republicans aren't doing work in their districts. So what are they doing? At least in the House of Representatives, well, they're ducking the Epstein files. Now we are hearing that when they come back, there is Representative Grijalva from Arizona. She needs to be sworn in. Mike Johnson is going to have to swear her in. Okay, how long can he go without swearing her in? Who knows? They are on a 48-hour notice to come back should the Senate actually pass something. So maybe they will come back if the Senate passes something to open the government. However, he doesn't want to swear her in. Why? Because she would be the 218th vote to open the House of, or to pass the discharge petition in the House of Representatives. Now, there is a special election coming up in December. I don't remember the exact date, December 2nd, maybe, in Tennessee for another representative seat in the House of Representatives. And this is a Republican district, typically, I believe. Now, if a Republican wins, it doesn't change the math for the discharge petition. They still need 218 because that is half of the total complement of the full House of Representatives. The full House is 435. Half of that would be 217 and a half. Well, that's how you get to 218. But this representative, if it's a Democrat, Mike Johnson may try to keep this person out as well, because that would be the 219th signature. If it's a Republican, while it doesn't offset Representative Grijalva's vote on the discharge petition, he could potentially try to do some funny business of swearing in that representative and not swearing in Representative Grijalva, just because that would change the math for them passing anything else in the House. Right now, they can only afford to lose, I believe it is 2 votes from their own caucus, and before things actually fail and they don't get anything done, because they're working with such razor-thin majorities. So I could see him potentially trying to swear in the one rep, but ignoring Representative Grijalva. He doesn't want her to come back or doesn't want her to come in. Not only is he avoiding the discharge petition because they do not want to release the Epstein files, but they're also worried about their margins because they can't lose any votes right now. They're screwed, and it's getting worse when you have people like Marjorie Taylor Greene basically calling them out and saying there's problems in their own party. She potentially could be a no vote on almost anything. Well, then they can only lose 1 vote. And because they're not a unified party, they're struggling to keep anything passed. Now, I mentioned the Epstein files. Okay. Why don't they want to release the Epstein files? Because Donald Trump is in them. That is the only explanation for the way he is acting in regards to the Epstein files. That he is in them and he is trying to protect himself and keep them from being made public. Now, he doesn't want them to be made public. Now, we are hearing from, was it Mike Wolf? And I could have the wrong name there. this biographer for Donald Trump apparently knows something that about the files, and apparently it is way worse than what we thought. That apparently there may be photos of Donald Trump with underage young girls sitting on his lap, potentially topless. Um, and that maybe that might not even be the worst of it, that there could be things even worse than that in there. Of course, Donald Trump doesn't want them released. So he is telling Mike Johnson, do whatever you can, make sure those files stay hidden, stay buried. But he ran on a campaign of releasing the Epstein files. He kept telling his voters who wanted the files released that they would release them. And he has kind of put himself in this situation. Well, what's going on with it? Why doesn't he want to release them? Because he's probably in there. And they keep screwing up at every step. They really thought he ran on this Epstein file idea, saying they were going to release him because he thought he could put somebody like Pam Bondi in it at the head of the DOJ, have her come out, make a public statement, said, yeah, I looked it over. There really isn't anything there. And that his base would just go, yeah, okay, and move on. That he could divert and distract away from the Epstein files. Well, it didn't work. They want those files released. They're rabid for having the files released. And he doesn't know what to do. He's lost about it. He's confused. Because normally he can divert and distract away, and his base just eats up whatever he says about it. They're not on this issue. Now, why? Because they have been told for so long that Democrats do all these awful things to children. They want the proof so they can finally own the libtards, so they can finally own us demon rats and whatever else they call us. Okay? They want to prove that we are these awful people and that they have the names of all of these people that were in the Epstein files. And any effort to say that there's nothing in them isn't working because they want to see all those names. Because they think you're going to find Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, which is possible that you might find Bill Clinton. They think Obama and Biden and all of these people are going to be in there and that they can actually prove us all wrong. Well, here's the thing. If any of those people or all of them are in the files, what we want on the left is for them to be charged if possible, if the statute of limitations hasn't run out, or if it has, but there are still civil penalties maybe they can go through. We want that to happen. But at the bare minimum, we want to know who it is. We want them held accountable. And whatever career they are in, we want them, to be made a social pariah. So they are no longer a part of anything. Now, if you look over to what is happening in England, I don't know the entire story here because I don't follow English politics as well as I do American. But you have now former Prince Andrew. Apparently, I think he is Charles's brother, who is been connected to Epstein. And the royal family has basically stripped him of his royal title and said, yeah, you can no longer live in this one castle. You got to go to this kind of outbuilding, this property, this house on this back part of this property here. We'll still take care of you, make sure you got somewhere to live, but basically you got to live in disgrace, and you're not going to be part of any royal activities anymore. And I'm also hearing, I read an article that said he may be facing criminal prosecution for some of what he has done. Okay, good. That is what we want from people connected to Epstein. If possible, that they should be charged, etc. And Donald Trump wants to get rid of the Epstein files. He does not want them brought to light. So he's telling Mike Johnson, do whatever you can to make them not happen. So when they come back and they swear in Representative Grijalva, they're going to have 218 votes on this discharge petition. Okay. And what could happen? Well, they bring it up for a vote. When it passes the House, it goes to the Senate. Maybe it dies in the Senate. This isn't about actually getting the files released. It's about putting Republican names to votes and holding their feet to the fire to make them accountable for voting to release the Epstein files and saying, well, do you want to keep the names hidden or not? And if Mike Johnson can't prevent this vote, it is entirely conceivable that Donald Trump would call some supporters in the House of Representatives and try to get rid of Mike Johnson as Speaker of the House. And it wouldn't take very many Republicans and all Democrats to sink Mike Johnson. Now, would Democrats save Mike Johnson? That depends. They could save him if it meant that he was going to give them what they want on this government shutdown. They could exchange a vote for saving Mike Johnson in exchange for, say, okay, we want 2 years of Affordable Care Act subsidies. We want you to bring that to the floor. We want a return of some of the money for Medicaid or what have you. And basically they could say, okay, you give us our demands on this government shutdown, we'll save your butt. Could happen. But they have no reason to save him at this point. He hasn't done them any favors. By purposely holding out Representative Grijalva and keeping the House out of session and not negotiating and doing all these things, they don't owe him anything. They don't need to save him. But they might if it's beneficial for them. And the other side of it is they could save him just because having him continue to be an embarrassment to the Republican Party could help the Democrats in the midterms. Not that I think they're going to need it. I think they could pick up 40 to 50 seats in the House of Representatives, and it's entirely possible they could pick up the Senate. Now, Donald Trump goes down to Mar-a-Lago while the Congress is in session or at least the Senate is, trying to negotiate something to open the government. And he's thrown himself a big old party. Hearing that they've got truffles and filet mignon and opera and all this stuff going on. He's throwing himself a party while the government is shut down, while people are struggling to eat, and while he himself, or at least his administration, has appealed a decision on whether or not to fund the SNAP program, the food stamp program. Talked about it yesterday. Judge on Thursday said, you must fully fund SNAP program. Okay. Donald Trump appealed to the First Circuit Court of Appeals while his administration did. Said, wait a minute, how are we supposed to do that? We need time to figure out how to fully fund it. Well, First Circuit Court of Appeals hadn't really answered in time, so they appealed to the Supreme Court, and Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson did grant a temporary stay. But I think it was only for a couple of days. From what I'm reading, it sounds like that temporary stay may run out as early as tomorrow. It was just basically saying the First Circuit Court of Appeals, she instructed them to act quickly, but that they needed more than a partial day or 1 day to come up with any sort of a ruling here. Now, some people are saying she did that specifically to make sure whatever ruling they come up with survive scrutiny, especially if it ends up in front of, like it possibly will, the entire Supreme Court. You have 6 conservative justices on the Supreme Court who have been trying to find ways to side with Donald Trump at every turn. And you need to have very well written and very well argued points, looking at case law and things like that, because they don't care about feelings or emotion, really. They're trying to just, well, that word isn't specifically in this deal, so out it goes. Just like what they did with Roe v. Wade. They overturned Roe v. Wade by saying, well, the 14th Amendment specifically doesn't say right to abortion, so no right to abortion. But what they said in the original ruling for Roe v. Wade was not that you had a right to an abortion specifically, is that you had a right to privacy, and that an abortion was a private medical decision. Therefore, the government had no place making a decision for you in a private decision. And they were ruling on privacy issues. But because it wasn't worded that way in the 14th Amendment, this Supreme Court tried to find a loophole in order to get rid of it, because that's what they were put together for, specifically was to get rid of Roe v. Wade. Now, he's throwing these parties while people are worried about whether or not they're going to make their food stamps, whether or not they're going to have money when they go to get food, if they're going to be able to get food, or if their food pantries are going to be able to help them. And I don't know if it is true or not. I'm hearing some creators on social media say that apparently members of the military that are overseas in Germany were told, if you can't afford food because we haven't been able to pay you yet, go to the local German food banks, use their resources, see if they can help you. And if that is true, that is despicable. Now, they've tried to pass legislation to fund the military. Both sides have kind of balked at it. For one reason or another, because they couldn't come to terms on how to do it. Now, ultimately, when they do fund the government, that will come to pass, that they will end up having uh, back pay, that they will be made whole. But the military still has to survive until that point. They got to, eat. They got to feed their families, etc. And that is something that we shouldn't be pawning off onto other governments if we have military members stationed in those foreign countries. Well, Donald Trump went to this party at Mar-a-Lago, right? And he flies down on Air Force One. And he once again causes concern about his health. He gets off Air Force One. He's walking very slow. Has got that death grip on the rail as he's going down, taking his time going down the steps. Now, he said during that Asia trip that he was told that he's got to take it careful going down steps, things like that. In part, I think he's worried about falling. Now, if he's having balance issues, that could be signs of, just at compounding the things that we've already seen that makes us believe he's had a stroke. And I know people who have had strokes that do have balance issues like that. Sometimes they end up needing a walker or a cane. Now, so far, Donald Trump hasn't needed that. And I think that's in part because I don't think he would allow himself to be seen with something like that. In his mind, that would be seen as weak. He never would want to have that image out there of him needing any sort of assistance to even stand. Okay. But he's going very slow down these steps. Then he gets over to the limo and he kind of gets in and he just kind of slumps into the limo. And I don't know if he's just exhausted. I don't know if he just can't keep himself upright anymore. Don't know. It is a sign that he is not as well as he would like you to believe. And then I believe it was Axios came out and said they looked at that meeting from the Oval Office on Thursday, and I believe it is the one where there was that medical emergency. Remember how I was talking about that, where Donald Trump kind of looked over, saw what was going on, then just kind of stood there with a blank look on his face, like he didn't know what to do? Well, because in part it ruined the routine of what he was supposed to. He was running on instinct, basically, of how to hold a meeting and how to talk to the press, etc. Something threw that off, and he couldn't react to it anymore. But that's not what Axios was talking about. If I believe it was Axios that said they went through, and if you look at the minutes where during that where it looked like he had his eyes closed or where he was fighting to stay awake, and we've all seen people who do that little number where they their head starts to droop and then they kind of startle themselves back awake. That I don't know exactly how long that whole White House meeting went, but there's at least 20 minutes there where it looked like he was sleeping. And we've seen him before having issues where he's falling asleep in public, where his face starts to droop. He has issues now with walking in a straight line. If he's grabbing the rail with a death grip because he's afraid of falling going down the steps of Air Force One. And just multiple other issues when it comes to things. He's not in good shape. And he looks worse and worse every day you see him. And I think he got bad news at Walter Reed when he went for his second annual physical this year, because you don't do two physicals in a year. I think it was a follow-up from something they were worried about. And they gave him an MRI. They gave him the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. Of course, he called it an aptitude test and tried to make it a big deal about how smart he was for passing it. Nobody could pass it. Well, most people can pass it. I think you could explain it to a literal child and they could pass it as long, above a certain age. Because all it is seeing how well your reasoning is. And the whole point is just to see where you're at compared to where you were, things like that. And the fact that they keep giving him this test should be concerning. But I think he got bad news because he's been pushing ever since then. We've had the No Kings protest after he had that second annual physical, that second annual checkup. Well, the No Kings protest, 7 to 10 million people hit the streets saying exactly what they thought of Donald Trump. He didn't like that. So what does he do? Tears down the east wing of the White House to build his ballroom. Okay, he's worried about building this big Donald J. Trump ballroom and how great it's going to be. It's going to be a monument to him. And he wants to put up an Arc de Triomphe like they have in France on the National Mall. Again, it's going to be the Arc de Trump. A big monument to him. He's now worried and he's talking about not getting into heaven. And he's talked about it numerous times, this administration, about how, well, he's got to end these wars to get to heaven and things like that. And now he's also talking about doing things like the ballroom, like the Ark, etc., talking about his legacy. He may not use that word specifically, but that's what he's thinking about. He's thinking about being remembered and having his name attached to things so that people don't forget who he is. So he goes down as some great person. I know they were floating an idea of changing an airport. I don't remember where, to the Donald J. Trump airport. And now he wants RFK Stadium, which is going back to the Washington Commanders on a lease program, I believe. They're building a new stadium for the Commanders, or they're retrofitting and renovating RFK Stadium for the Commanders, and he wants it to be named after himself. The Donald J. Trump Stadium, something like that. Why? Well, because he thinks he deserves it because he facilitated them getting the lease on RFK Stadium. Except he didn't, not really. He was trying to hold that lease up and hold it ransom because he wanted them to go back from being the Commanders to the Redskins. Didn't work. The owner said, yeah, we're not doing that. And that is in part because the Redskins, it is a racially charged name. It was always meant as a derogatory term. Now, and I know there are going to be some Native American peoples who don't care, and they think it's fine. And there are others that have issues with it. And the fact of the matter is, right now, the owners are the ones that have the ultimate say. And they said, yeah, I see where people are saying it has a negative connotation, so we changed it. And at that point, that should be where it stands, but not for Donald Trump. He wanted it to go back. He wanted it to go back to that racist name. That didn't work. But now he's saying, well, I helped you get that stadium. Translation, it happened under Donald Trump. He didn't really do much. But you should name the stadium after me. Again, more worrying about his legacy. He wants to do all of these things to make it so he's remembered. And that is a sign to me of somebody who is not well, who is staring at their own mortality. And somebody worried about what the future is going to hold for themselves. It's not a good thing for Donald Trump right now. I think he is going to be not making it to the end of his term. It is a very real possibility that Donald Trump does not survive all the way until 2029, when his term would be over. Now, if you ask him right now, of course, he would tell you, oh, I feel great. I'm going to run for a third term. Based on how he acts in public, that's all bluster. I think privately, I don't think he wants a third term. I don't think he could physically handle it if he lives that long, and I don't think he makes it. Some people are suggesting that he may not make it to the end of the year. Now, that may be a little hopeful. But I think there's a good chance that his health it gets bad enough that Republicans make a choice sometime around the midterms, if he is still with us at that point. That they are either going to try to do something ahead of the midterms, trying to change the outcome so maybe they can stay in power because they're afraid of, like I said earlier, losing the House by 40 to 50 seats, or they're afraid of losing the House and the Senate, and they think maybe if they can get rid of Donald Trump, if they do it close enough to the election, voters will remember it and remember them only for doing that and getting rid of this senile old man, and that it would maybe at least prevent them from losing the Senate. But then they would have J.D. Vance as president if they had to get rid of Donald Trump, or if he just doesn't make it. Now, is J.D. Vance going to be worse than Donald Trump? No. Is he more evil than Donald Trump? Yes. But there's a difference. First of all, J.D. Vance doesn't act like a petulant toddler, deciding things on a whim and on feelings, and oh well, you attacked me, so I got to attack you 3 times worse. He doesn't do that. Okay, if Canada comes out with an ad that attacks J.D. Vance, J.D. Vance isn't going to hit Canada with 50% tariffs just because. J.D. Vance will probably get some of these clowns out of the White House. I think RFK and Linda McMahon and some of these people would be gone from their positions. He would be able to get qualified people in there and go back to more of a normal politic. Now, would he try to pass and do things that are very fucked up? Yes. There's also the problem is he wouldn't have the same sway over Congress. He just wouldn't. So we would have J.D. Vance. But, and this is where a lot of people get caught up in the emotion, just because the Speaker of the House is next in line for presidential succession does not mean he automatically becomes the vice president. J.D. Vance would get to pick a VP. Okay. He would select somebody, and then Congress would have to approve that person with a 2/3 majority in each house. So they wouldn't be able to pick somebody completely off the rails. They would have to pick somebody kind of normal. And J.D. Vance may not get anybody through Congress. He may have to go it alone without a VP that entire time. Now, if the Democrats take over and they win the House in the midterms, J.D. Vance becomes president, and there is no VP because he couldn't get anybody through Congress because he couldn't pick anybody reasonable. Then, and something happened to J.D. Vance, then the Speaker of the House, which probably would be Hakeem Jeffries, would become president. That would be the only way, and even if it is Mike Johnson at the time, that would be the only way Mike Johnson could become president. It's the only way the Speaker of the House becomes president is if there is a vacancy at both president and vice president at the same time. Now, if you look at history, when Nixon resigned, his VP Ford became president. Ford appointed Rockefeller. Rockefeller got through Congress. They made it to the end of the term. He ran for re-election and lost. But the Speaker of the House didn't move up. The only way the Speaker would become vice president is if that was the person that J.D. Vance picked to be the vice president. So we'll have to see how they play with it. Now, some people are suggesting this idea that what they could do is J.D. Vance would pick a normal Republican, say Brian Kemp out of Georgia, maybe Chris Christie, something like that. One of the more reasonable Republicans, maybe even going back and grabbing a Bush, maybe Jeb Bush, doing something like that. Somebody who's not objectionable. Democrats might get on board for that. But then then they may have a plan for J.D. Vance either to resign, and if he resigns, there's nothing Congress can do to really prevent that, or that the Republicans would try to impeach and remove J.D. Vance and put this reasonable person in, trying to give themselves an edge going into 2028. And I don't know that Democrats would go along with that. They may actually end up saving J.D. Vance in a impeachment trial if the only motive is to get rid of Vance to bring in whoever he picked as his VP. And if if there is even any worry about that from J.D. Vance, if that is what they're even thinking about doing, you know he's going to be walking that line with a tightrope, trying to make sure that he doesn't get removed by his party, especially if it ends up being a thing where the Republicans have to impeach and remove Donald Trump because he won't go because of his health, or if they have to use the 25th Amendment again because of his health, or because just being connected to Donald Trump is that untenable and he has gotten that far gone, they may have to use impeachment just because they're trying to save some legitimacy for their own party. Now, they should have probably done that a long time ago. They should have just voted to remove him going back to the 2021 when he had done January 6th. They had a chance to get rid of Donald Trump then. They chose not to because they thought they could pass it off to the DOJ, and the DOJ would take care of their dirty work. And then Merrick Garland sat on his hands, and we are where we are. So even though we could end up with President J.D. Vance between now and 2029, he's not going to be worse because he doesn't have the same pull that Donald Trump has right now. He's not the same person. And he just doesn't have the same pull over the Republican Party. He doesn't have the same influence over the Republican base. And Republicans wouldn't be as keen on doing everything he wants to do. Plus, he is going to be smarter about how they do things. And he's not going to be just trying to flood the zone and do all of this all at once. So that's just where I think Donald Trump and his health is at. He may not make it to the end of the year. If you follow the Rational Boomer, you probably know Ed. Ed is a routine guest over on the Rational Boomer podcast, much like myself. And Ed thinks Thanksgiving, that Donald Trump may not make it to Thanksgiving. Now, that's being pretty optimistic, considering it's only a couple of weeks away. But he's not looking good. I don't think he makes it to the end of his term. And I would be surprised if Republicans don't try to replace him if he is still around by the midterms. All right, so that is what I've got for you today on the Analytical Iowan podcast. I want to thank you for taking time to join me today. I want to remind you, though, speaking of the Rational Boomer podcast, as some of you may already have been aware, I am today's guest over on the Rational Boomer podcast. Now, full transparency, Mike and I recorded that Friday night. So, recorded it Friday night, so that way I gave Mike, he needed some coverage for an extra day because he had things going on to make sure he didn't miss an episode. So that episode went up today. I encourage you to check it out over on the Rational Boomer podcast. Mike and I have a great conversation like we always do. We cover a lot of topics. And I think I turned around and recovered some of them here on the Analytical Iowan podcast. Encourage you to check that out. I will be back tomorrow with even more stuff to talk about because there's always stuff to talk about in the world of news and politics. Hope you have a great day, and we'll be back to do it again tomorrow.
That was Eric. That does it for our analysis today. If you appreciated us cutting through the noise to get to the critical context, please make sure you're subscribed to the Analytical Iowan podcast on Spotify and YouTube. We'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.